In spite of its large fan base, the Star Fox games always seem to have their own amount of fan hatred as well. As such, only two games have been consistently praised for being amazing: the original Star Fox and the Nintendo 64 remake. Initially, I was only going to review the Nintendo 64 game, but then I looked up online and found that it didn't actually sell as well as the Super Nintendo version, which is weird because I personally don't know anyone else who owns the Super Nintendo version, but then again, I know very few people who still own their Super Nintendos. Anyway, on to the review. Well, there's one thing no one can deny about the original Star Fox. It is an ugly, ugly game. This was the dawn of 3D and one of Nintendo's first examples of 3D, and it sure looks like it. Anyway, Star Fox is sort of a 3D shoot-'em-up with a simple goal of making it to the end with as much points as possible, and with all your comrades safe. At the end of every stage, there's a boss fight with something. I'm never sure what they are. The two types of stages you play in are in deep space and on random planets, with the only big difference being that one has a floor and one doesn't. You'll probably notice though that in the space zones your plane automatically goes into a POV mode, which allows for more precision when it comes to aim at the cost of making obstacles harder to dodge compared to the third person view. Now, I'm playing this on my Super Nintendo, but I'll tell you now, most of what I'll say will probably apply to a Virtual Console release, since the classic controller isn't too far off from the original Super Nintendo controller. That being said, the controls in this game feel a little off. It's hard to really say why, but it just doesn't feel like you have total control over your plane. Thankfully, the game supplies a tutorial that you can avoid if you want, but I'd recommend it to get used to a lot of the little quirks of playing this game. There are 3 paths you can play this game with, which essentially act as easy, medium, and hard mode. And I've got to say, I like the way they did this, because I hate it when hard mode is just medium mode with stricter settings, because certain things just don't click. The stages themselves are nice and challenging, and especially satisfying to beat, since the ending bosses are always interesting and a nice way to end the levels. Some issues with the game do start to come up though. For example, the game is very short. Playing through each route will probably only take you about an hour if you don't die, which is unlikely. Many people also hold it against the game that your so-called teammates rarely help you out until you've helped them out of a jam. I never held much issue with this though, since trying not to shoot your teammates in a game like this would have just been annoying. In spite of these problems, design is nicely varied through each of the stages, and even each of the routes, which I consider a great decision for adding replayability and keeping the game fresh. Another nice touch is the score counter at the end of each stage, which scores you on something. It's not exactly clear what it's scoring you on, but you get the general impression that you did something good, which is actually reinforced over time since the scores seemed to lower when I did poorly. There were circumstances though in which my low score only strengthened my frustration, because even though this game is fun and does a good job of keeping everything fresh, it has a great deal of problems. The problem with the graphics isn't just the aesthetics, but rather how it gives you trouble when you're trying to play. The weak frame rate can make the controls feel really laggy, and the few colors become an issue when your teammates come on screen or when you're trying to fight the enemy because they're barely a different color from the background. The weak graphics also make it tough to tell depth at times, which makes it hard to dodge obstacles because you're never sure what's coming first. And a lot of power-ups have a similar issue, though it's the reverse circumstance there. Many of the bosses on the harder routes are incredibly cheap and also very tough to read, since it can be hard to tell what they're about to do thanks to the technical limitations. A good majority of the boss battles, however, are actually well structured and challenging in a good way, with easy to read patterns, but attacks that still take some skill to dodge. These bosses actually make you feel satisfied at the end of the stage, and this is strengthened by the point system that rewards the player with a continue if they do very, very well. These bosses also feel like something different compared to the stages, which are much more continuously fast-paced, while the bosses mostly seem like very tense moments, and the intermission between stages gives the player some nice breathing room. This, however, leads me to my 2 biggest problems with this game. As previously mentioned, the controls are a little wonky. Well, they get even worse when there are a lot of objects on screen, which combined with the weak frame rate can lead to some issues in hectic situations or boss battles. This can be especially frustrating since many of the annoying bosses are in levels that have no checkpoints, meaning that you'll need to end up replaying the entire level all over again to even get a chance to figure out what to do. Though this circumstance doesn't happen often, it is a brick wall to progress and kills much of the flow that this game could create. Even with tough-to-read bosses, though, every boss seems to be satisfying to beat and still complement most of the levels very well, very few of which really have big misdesigns other than a few technical problems that I've already mentioned. As many brick walls as this game has in the form of rough bosses and a lot of technical issues, the game before these issues is still very fun and satisfying. There's a lot of replayability in a game like this as well because of a lot of little smart designs made to the game to make it feel more rewarding. The continues for beating the game with a high score is one of those things, as is the fact that your weapons continuously upgrade until you die. The reason this last one works so well is that the weapon power-ups are kind of rare or tough to grab, so it feels all the more rewarding when you have these ridiculously huge lasers, especially since you know that that also means you have stayed alive for a long time. This game's biggest problems are technical faults that do get in the way of gameplay, the occasional misdesigned levels and cheap enemies, and a few brick wall bosses, but other than that, it's a fast-paced, arcade-style game that's really fun to play. Since most of my gripes aren't very specific to my taste, and this game is still very user-friendly, the score for both myself and general audiences will be an 8.5, which in a word means this game is almost amazing. Now, unlike the Mega Man games where I felt the design was not different enough to justify buying more than 2 of them, I actually think it's worth judging these games separately because they really aren't as samey in design as you'd think. Though they are both 3D shoot-em-ups, the technical update of the Nintendo 64 allows for a lot more drastic changes to the formula, and I'm quite glad that they did. To keep things simple before going into the next review, Star Fox was fast-paced, straightforward most of the time, very simple, and chose level design that fit most of its technical limitations that were placed on it. Remember, most. Star Fox 64, on the other hand, is slightly slower paced, a bit story and character driven, and more complex in how the player continues and how they are rewarded. These differences are actually quite large, so I can review these games in a separate manner, and tell you that regardless of how good Star Fox 64 is, you should also buy Star Fox on the Super Nintendo if it ever goes on Virtual Console, or if you own a Super Nintendo. First off, I'll say that the tutorial in Star Fox 64 is much more in-depth than the one in the Super Nintendo, and is very helpful because of it. More big differences between these games is the new additions of a charge to your weapon and all range mode, and I have a lot to say about that soon enough. Now, I'm actually playing this game on an actual Nintendo 64, and I'd recommend you do the same, since many of the flight controls have been relegated to the C-Stick in the Virtual Console release, and considering how awkward the button layout already is, I wouldn't want it to get any worse. This game is still a 3D shoot-em-up that mostly involves going forward and shooting as many enemies down as possible to score the maximum number of points. The graphical update allows for a greater variety in the enemies, obstacles, and environments, all of which have a very nice level of polish and detail to them. New hardware doesn't guarantee the disappearance of technical flaws, however, and when the screen gets crowded, you'll occasionally notice some lag. Thankfully, though, this is rare, not too big of a hindrance on the game, and nowhere near as bad as the Super Nintendo version. You no longer need to choose your own route, but instead your route is decided by what you did in the previous stage, though it's not always clear what in particular is being watched, so you may need to look it up online. This injection of adventure game elements tears this game a bit away from its arcade-style predecessor, and this helps it stand a bit more on its own. The voices in this game are pretty dated, but mostly in a funny way, which doesn't really hurt the game since it doesn't try to take itself too seriously.
You'll never defeat Andross!
While this game is a bit more story and character driven than the Super Nintendo version, that's not saying a lot, and the voices have very little purpose other than being very funny or annoying. The Ur-Wings in this game are much more versatile in terms of their movement this time around, and you even get to pilot around in a tank and a submarine in a few levels. The versatility of the Ur-Wings, however, is dampened by the previously mentioned control button placement, though I'd blame the controller itself more than anything. These moves are also really problematic to actually use as well, since they require a combination of button and direction presses that don't often register immediately, which in the heat of battle can be a problem. Thankfully, these moves are not often needed in any situation other than all range mode, but they are absolutely a problem in that situation. While the charge to the laser basically kills any satisfaction you may gain from upgrading your weapon, The way the charge erupts into a giant explosion that takes out extra enemies while giving you extra points adds some strategy and timing to many fights that can be satisfying in its own way. This game is also very user-friendly when it comes to lives, being very generous with them both with the stages and as score rewards, and before entering the next stage, the game always gives you the chance to pick the easier path if you choose to do so. I think they started to get a little carried away when it came to making the game user-friendly though, because oftentimes the levels are barely challenging at all, and the bosses are mostly easy. This does ultimately mean that this game does have a great sense of flow to it, but even this is hurt because several of the bosses that are actually tough are just cheap, or involve your partners who are horrible shots. The other levels involving tanks and submarines are also not as good as the R-Wing levels for their own reasons. The tank levels are actually pretty unique and kinda cool, but the aiming mechanics can just get annoying. The submarine is also hindered by ridiculous slowdown and unnecessarily dark level design that results in a lot of confusion and cheap shots. Remember, however, I said that those are the reasons why those levels are not as good as the R-Wing levels. The tank is still a satisfying form of transport, and while the submarine can feel very frustrating, it's still an interesting change of pace thanks to its different combat mechanics and slower speed. Not only that, but those forms still maintain the very satisfying timing and placement mechanic of the charged up weapons that the R-Wings have, just in a different way. I'd also like to say that while several of the bosses that are actually hard are cheap, those that aren't are actually well designed and very satisfying to beat because they often feel like puzzles that you have to solve in your own way. Okay, I can't put this off anymore. There is one common consensus among even the die-hard fans of this game. Your partners are absolutely horrendous. During these straight shoot-'em-up style stages, they aren't too bad since they're easy to save and don't get in the way too much, but my god, they are the absolute worst in all range mode. First of all, I'd like to point out that I hate all range mode. Taking out enemies like this is annoying because the R-Wings take forever to turn around and the special maneuvers are only helpful against chasers just behind you. This results in long, drawn-out, boring boss fights with only really one strategy: get behind them and shoot. Sometimes though, you'll have multiple enemies and they'll pull this strategy out on your partners, none of whom know a way out. So what does this mean? You'll have to save them over and over and over and over again, each time being forced to listen to the same repetitive voice clip over and over again.
What's taking you so long, Fox?
Oh no!
Take care of the guy behind me, Fox!
Fox, get this guy off me!
Shoot! He's right behind me!
This is really starting to tick me off!
I know I'm making a big deal out of something that's only about 5% of the game, but these levels stick out like a sore thumb and really give an enormous blemish to this game that's always easy to point to. Still, credit must be given to this game. For all the problems that this game has, it's almost never boring, and every stage does all that it can to really make itself different from the others. This game is also very replayable thanks to its large back catalog of unlockable material, almost all of which bring their own type of challenge to the table and let their presence known once you've done them correctly. While this game does have some incredibly noticeable blemishes, it's still very enjoyable in its own right. Personally, I'll give Star Fox 64 an 8.0 for being a very smooth experience with a lot of variety and several well-done moments of challenge. For general audiences, the score will stay the same because even though I think most people will be even more critical than myself about all range mode, you guys would probably appreciate the flow and the minor challenge of this game more than myself. So for general audiences, Star Fox 64 gets an 8.0. Yeah, it's great and worth buying. So, yeah, two standout games from the same franchise that actually lived up to their hype. If you haven't played either one of these games, they're worth tracking down. Oh yeah! And to end this review, I'd like to point one last thing out. Both these games have amazing soundtracks.